I came to find the God I know isn't there, but I walked inside the doors all the same. The spires like Gothic trees with crosses that bear the weight of guilt and fear. A thief I see by the edge of the sea, a glimmer of stone, or was it water that shone? Arrest him, behead him, all the same. I weep for the friend I lost before the crowd. Reconcile in the milk of sorrow that feeds the overgrowth beneath the stones. It was cold outside, too cold to think of their faces that they loved more than mine.
Hey y'all, Kelly here. Welcome to the Ground Shots podcast, a podcast that explores our relationship to ecology through conversations and storytelling. I'm recording this from the southern Idaho and Utah border, visiting a friend on her family's land. We're helping out her dad to get him set up for the winter. He lives out here in this rustic cabin that is from the 1800s pioneer days, and it's been really cool to kind of walk this land this past week and find a lot of really interesting plants and play in the juniper trees, and yeah, just really like observe this mountain and this zone right here. Haven't explored this area that much over the years, and yeah, it's really cool to be able to do that in this moment, in this time right now where I'm kind of like bopping around with the season. So it's been a little bit since I've done a new episode on the podcast. I have been in a lot of spaces and places this summer, for better or for worse, and did a lot of teaching in person at ancestral skills gatherings, teaching folks about plants, and a little bit of online teaching this summer. Mostly just been trying to be present with the people I'm around, the stories I'm hearing and not recording them, and just taking stock of what important relationships I have in this world, in different places, and trying to learn as much as I can while I am moving about right now about the plants and ecologies where I go. So it's been quite a summer, quite a year, quite a 2 years, but it's been quite a summer of being back on the West Coast for a little bit, deepening some relationships with plants and place and people, and trying to focus on learning some plants that I haven't known as well in the past, like biscuit roots, for example. My time in Colorado and walking on the Colorado Trail also gave me a lot of insight into plants that I know but maybe didn't know as well when I was doing research, botanical research in the West. So been excited to kind of come back around and like look again for plants that I knew but didn't know as well. So it's been great and also intense in a lot of ways. Going back to places where I've spent time in different capacities in the past, I'm realizing for myself that there's so many multi-layers of what it means to relate to a place with past experiences. It's a mix sometimes of good experiences and bad, and like a place can have the weight or the lightness of all those things mixed together. And for me, having been on the road a lot over the past 10 years with big periods too of like staying in place as well, I find that it's an interesting mixed bag to revisit some of those places. There's a sense of familiarity which brings a lot of joy that comes up, and there's also the feeling of other things comes up too. I spent a lot of years in Northern California. If you've been listening to this podcast since the beginning, you have heard me airing this from random locations all over, but especially in Northern California. And I'm still processing like all the years I spent there, feeling kind of like isolated in the work that I was doing and not being around a lot of community and friends and people. And I'm realizing how important that is for me. And a lot of my moving around and traveling is in search of community and building community and connecting to the people I feel connection to. But it's getting hard to like be someone who's sort of on the edge, like an edge walker of sorts, being kind of a person that weaves the web all the time between people and places, and not quite feeling sure where at any moment I should land in and feel good and held in one place. It's an interesting dilemma, given that I used to be really woven and rooted in place years and years ago when I farmed in North Carolina, and there was enough there for me, and I'm not sure if that place has that for me now. So it's kind of a funny moment right now where I feel drawn to a lot of places. I guess I could say I feel like I left myself in many places, and I need to figure out where I maybe want to like spend the most time. After all of this gathering of knowledge and information, I feel really compelled to share it in community and with people in place. It's been just such a feeling of pulling in the past couple years, so just navigating all of that right now and trying to figure it all out. But I'm not going to share too much more about that right now. There's a lot to all of that, but here I am in this moment, in this place, and it's a beautiful day out. I've got plums drying on strings hanging from my windows. My solar panels are getting lots of sun where I'm at, so I feel like I can keep my fridge on. And I have willow drying next to me from gathering in along the Snake River the past few weeks. And like life is good too, despite for me feeling kind of in a funny existential place right now of not knowing where I fully belong, and how that can be a complicated process of figuring out, and it can be for a lot of people, I think people and place really create that, and the plants, the feel, all these things create that for us, and also our internal landscape. So there's a lot there to layer and work with and play with, and I hope for anybody listening to this podcast who feels inspired by the work that I do. I get messages all the time about that, like, oh, you changed my life, or this podcast has brought me so much perspective, clarity, things to think about. It really changed how I see I could live my life, or like things that I could focus on, and I really appreciate that feedback. I really do. It keeps me going with all of this, even though a lot lately I felt kind of like, what am I doing? Feels like it's kind of hurt me to a degree. Not feeling like I have consistent support all the time. There's been periods where I feel like I do, people close in my life, but needing consistent support and holding it all I'm just such a collaborator. I'm such a we-oriented, not I-oriented person. So I think that that's what I'm seeking right now in my life, with lots of different potential people and situations. But that's where I'm at. Like, the acting as an individual, this random white woman on the road going around thinking she knows things about ethnobotany. Like, I don't want to hold it all. So I invite invitations for collaboration. And if you're into human design too, I'm a projector, so I guess that means invitation for me is like the key thing. I shouldn't be doing anything unless I'm invited. So that's an interesting thing to navigate in the world. But as someone hosting a podcast where I'm inviting other people in, it's an interesting thing to navigate what that means. So I'm thinking about, on the podcast coming up soon, doing some different kinds of interviews that go more into eco-somatics in relationship to land tending, and we talk about that a little bit in this episode that I'm about to share with you at moments, but it's definitely been a big thing on my mind this year, and I haven't shared a lot about that on the podcast. I feel like a couple episodes hinted at that, or like spoke to that to a degree. The one with Sarah Galvin of the House of Yore. She's out of Alaska. A lot of people really love that episode. We speak to that a little bit. The importance of how trauma transforms us and like rebirths us, and the importance of how the trigger is actually information, how it's actually part of the catalyst for change, and a lot of these things I think we can't separate out from our relationship to land. So thinking about going that direction for some of the episodes in the next 6 months. So if you feel like that's something you're interested in, if you have any thoughts or feelings or connections in that realm, I'm really open to hearing. I mean, I've been definitely paying attention to some new philosophers' work, like Sophie Strand and other people too, and really thinking about reimagining our relationship to land, which is just the biggest theme I think I explore on this podcast, is also hand in hand in reimagining how we socially relate to one another, how we relate to ourselves, the things that we accumulate in our bodies past our lives, and then in our experiences in the world, and how we then relate to the map of ecology within our relations with each other, and what parts of that are like also toxic, what parts of that are things that we're repeating and doing that are not actually good, that we are like somatically trained to do to one another, or we're supposed to be communicating with each other according to the culture at large, that actually might not be serving us, just like, seeing the land as a place to extract from is not serving us, which is like a big part of the conversations that we're having in this coming episode of the podcast. And just thought I'd give you a little bit of some of those thoughts as introducing this episode, because I haven't been on in a couple months, and I'm not gone, haven't disappeared from this. It's just been a hard like year and a half for me, and I'm just re-navigating and figuring out how I want to hold space for this and do this project, and what capacity I actually have to do that, and what ways I want to do that. And so it's just a little bit slower right now. What's really helpful is if folks continue to donate money to the project, because the funds it takes to just keep this thing alive, like I have subscriptions to things like Dropbox and the podcast host that I use that cost me money every single month, whether I'm airing anything or not. So, and for me to pay for the time and energy I put into this, which for many years I've not paid myself anything, and it's starting to kind of wear on me in the cumulative like effect of like that kind of visceral, tangible, actionable support. Just giving me feedback is freaking awesome. And also, I had a dream recently, and it could mean many things, but in the dream, I was hanging out with my friend Sigh-Moon, who's actually a part of this episode, weirdly enough. In the dream, Sigh-Moon's like handed me a tarot card, and was like, on the tarot card was like a cactus with a bunch of little cactus pads sticking off the main cactus, and on each pad were flowers, except for one. one didn't have a flower, and Sigh-Moon told me in the dream that I am not letting myself flower, but I'm letting all these other beings and things and energies and ideas flower. I wonder what that means. It might not mean anything, but I think about like what I need to feel supported in continuing this work. So I'm gonna just put it out there, and I do it a lot of the episodes on the podcast, but it's just helpful for me to continue to remind y'all we live in a capitalist world and gotta keep it going and gotta keep our lives going in a capitalist world. And I know we're in like a recession of sorts right now, so everyone's abundance is not necessarily there, but I need the support. I have a Patreon. It's patreon.com/fsegeandsalt. I have a lot of backlog of stuff on there. It's if you join as a member, you can get access to all of that pretty much, and videos and writings and all kinds of things from years on the road when I used to put a lot into the Patreon. Right now, I just basically put like early access to classes, free access to online classes that I teach, videos, and then early access to podcast episodes. I felt like for a while I was giving so much to Patreon, and it was just so much to keep up with that I don't really put as much into it as I used to, but there was so much there for you if you would like to join and like be supportive of this project. And maybe in the future I'll vamp that up again. I don't know if that's going to be the best platform for me in the future to do certain things that I think could be really interesting, like video group meetups and stuff like that. But for now, it's still there, and it's super, super appreciated, the income that I can get from that to pay for even just this podcast existing. And that's always linked in the show notes, patreon.com/ofsegeandsalt. You can go there and become a member and unbecome a member at any point. I also have links to things like PayPal and Cash App and Venmo that you can donate one time or regularly if you would like an amount that you choose, and when you choose it. Anything like that also is super helpful. And then if you do it, put it, make it out to friends and family, or like don't write on there that you're paying me. Just put a picture or something and say thanks. Whatever you feel like in that realm, that would be super helpful. Also, you can support the podcast by giving us a review on iTunes. All those reviews really help the podcast get seen, and I love reading your reviews, and I've gotten a few new ones recently, and so thank y'all to the folks who've totally done that. And also, you can share this episode on your social media. I know with this particular episode, it might end up being shared in different places because of the topic, but any time you feel called to share this podcast, this particular episode, any other particular episodes you love, that always really helps spread the word. A lot of the audience for this podcast has been super grassroots, spread through word of mouth and through little pieces and parts and like connections made, and I love that it's been an organic process. So thank you to folks who have been doing that. Really, really appreciate it. I also wanted to let y'all know that I'm offering a couple classes online via Zoom this fall. One is on the ecology and medicine of cottonwoods, and the other is on the ethnobotany of juniper. And I've offered the ethnobotany of juniper one before. It was really a popular class, so I know that I'm pretty sure that there's plenty of y'all out there that want to learn more about that. And also the cottonwoods class I've never offered before, so I'm excited to get to reshare my juniper class in a new way, and then also to offer this class on the cottonwoods. These are both classes based on research I've been doing over a decade on plants from like a horizontal perspective, I like to say. Researching plants from like the level of, say, a genus or a plant that maybe grows in a lot of different places and ecologies, and how that plant likes to exist in those places and how people like to be in relationship to those plants in those places. So, something like juniper, for example, we have species of juniper all around the world, and there's circumboreal species, there's species that grow in a lot of different terrains and climates. Some of them only grow in a couple places and some grow a lot more widespread. So there's so much ripeness to all of that, and I've spent so much time and energy creating resources on these plants from this perspective, and I'd love to just host these to offer more of a formal lecture, conversation, storytelling session about them, and for you to be able to actually engage me and ask questions. So if you want to sign up for those classes, you can find them linked in my website store. It's where I often sell tinctures and stuff when I have them for sale, which I'm hoping to also do a little sale this fall, but I haven't officially figured out that yet. But stay tuned on here. I will let you know if I do. But these two classes, the dates have been set for early November and early December, so go check it out if you are interested. I also offer a certain amount of free admission to Black, Indigenous, people of color. If you want to get in on the class, just email me at kelly@ofsedgeandsalt.com. That's also where you can email me for like any kinds of like inquiries, resources, thoughts, feelings you have about like things going on with the podcast, suggestions you might have for people that you think I should interview. And I'm not really super interested in doing like product advertisement type partnership things on the podcast. I know that that's like a way I could potentially like gain income on here, but that's not really what I'm interested in doing. I'm hoping that y'all can support me enough through grassroots funding that I don't need to like advertise things for you to buy in order for this to be supported. But maybe I'm being I don't know, hopeful in a way that maybe I shouldn't. But anyhow, for the BIPOC scholarship slots in my classes, email me, kelly@ofsedgeandsalt.com for questions, inquiries, feedback. Also email me there. That email is easier for me to navigate for like specific things around the podcast and the Ground Shots project. Also, I'm hoping to try to do the Colorado Trail again next summer to continue the Colorado Trail Plant to Go project, to add another layer of knowledge and information and like inquiry into that work, which was a project that I started with Gabe Crawford that is basically like researching plants along a walking route that is traditionally used these days as like a sporty through hike walk, and people often just go through it really fast and don't like stop and slow down to look at what's actually growing and what's actually happening on the land. And the biggest part of that project, I mean, Gabe and I had put our own individual works kind of together in that project, and his around like his focus on seed planting and wild tending and looking for wild gardens, and mine on like surveying plants and researching plants and ecologies. And we kind of put it together to do that walk a couple years ago, kind of at the beginning of the pandemic. And we created a lot of data from that walk. We journaled, we GPS pointed plant seeding locations that we did with like some of the plants that will be mentioned in this episode are some of the ones that we planted, like Yampa and biscuit roots, Mariposa lilies. These are also, many of these are plants that also grow already there, but these are plants that people historically interacted with on the trail. And we did a bunch of episodes on the podcast relating to this project, and so you can go back and listen to those if you're interested in hearing about more of the like inner workings of what it was all about in the process of it. But I'd be really curious to do it again and check on the plantings that we did to see what's come up, what didn't come up, and also do another survey layer. We kind of tried to survey the plants of each section. At the end of it, we got a little burnt out because there's a lot of repetition of like what plants grow in certain places. So we don't have like an official list for like the last 100 miles of the trail, but like the first chunk, we definitely have these like intricate lists and notes and naturalist notes, and had a lot of ideas for how we might want to put together an alternate guide to the trail through this lens of looking at how humans historically have been in relationship with the land in in the places that you move through on foot on the trail. So there's a lot of ideas that were written down and like thought about around like integrating alternate ways of being on a journey, alternate ways of tracking, alternate ways of tending land and walking that also engage the history of mining in the landscapes that we move through, the history of the beavers and the places that we move through, like and things like trees that were altered along the trails for certain purposes historically, and patterns that were noticed. I think the project has a lot of potential, and I haven't been spending as much time in Colorado the past couple years, but I would like to try to walk the trail again and add layers to this project. But in order for me to be able to do that, or for anyone else who might come along, I feel like funding would be really helpful. So I have gotten some direction from some folks towards like grants that I could get for the project, at least for the plant documentation part of it, and the like philosophical, ethnobotanical, critical ethnobotany piece of it. And if you have any ideas about how that project could be better funded for me to be able to do a walk, and if other people come along, I could facilitate maybe like sharing, being from a place of being able to share about those landscapes and plants without it draining me and like taking a lot from me. I think I'm at a point where like being self-funding all of this stuff doesn't work as well as getting support and from other directions to make this project happen. So if you have any thoughts or feelings about how to make that work, you can also email me at kelly@ofsedgeandsalt.com. So this episode features Nikki Hill and our friend Sigh-Moon, who came along to assist in the conversation. We decided to do this conversation in Southern Oregon, where we were hanging out this past early August, to bring some attention to Nikki's article she just published through Counterpunch called Botany is Archaeology to Stop a Lithium Mine. So I wanted to get into the conversation about what this article was about on a podcast episode so that folks can also hear Nikki articulate and speak to what she has been exploring by publishing this piece. And just to give you a little background on Nikki, though she's been on the podcast a couple times, so you might be familiar with her episodes on wild tending and questioning invasion biology. She's been on 3 different episodes, including the collaborative piece we did with Calibri Terra Sonnenblum of Voices for Nature and Peace, where she, Calibri, and Gabe interview Matt Chu, one of my favorite episodes. He's a person that studied invasion biology out of the University of Arizona, so really great episode if you want to go back and listen to that one or any of the ones that Nikki's been a part of. So Nikki Hill can be found chasing wildflowers throughout the western U.S., and she's not sure where her adoration of plants began, but they share a kindred spirit. Nikki earned a bachelor's degree in environmental science and botany, which led her to the field of habitat restoration nearly 16 years ago, and it's probably been 18 years at this point, because this is the bio she gave me a couple years ago when we first had her on the podcast. Disillusioned by methodology that focused on eradication, she struck off on her own. She spent 6 years growing food and medicine, first as an urban farmer and then as a nomadic rural farmer. Since 2014, she has been exploring her feral roots as a wild tender, planting gardens outside agricultural boundaries. Her hope is to foster habitat resilience by sowing a living seed bank for the future, in a spirit of collaboration with the non-human world. And I'll be putting her website in the show notes. And our friend Sigh-Moon, who came along for this conversation, lives in Southern Oregon and does awesome land tending and wild tending work, and is a sweet person to hang with and play with plants with. And so it was really awesome to get Sigh-Moon to come along and ask some poignant questions and make some poignant statements and comments throughout this interview as we all sit around under some juniper trees to just speak about this article. So this article is, I don't want to give too much away because there's so much to the meat of this episode, but just to give you a gist right before we head into it, because I know this has been a long intro so far. Nikki did a survey at a place called Thacker Pass, which is slated to become a lithium mine, and in the activism work that's happening around Thacker Pass, the advocacy for that place, there's been a lot of conversations around how to speak to what is important about that place. And Nikki's background studying plants in Nevada led her to wander there and use her skills to try to reframe plants as living archaeology of place. And so she did some survey work on her own, not sponsored by anybody officially, to kind of take note of what's there so that folks can have an idea of like another perspective on why these plants are important and why this place, which is special and sacred to so many people, should be advocated for, not just for like archaeology that is tangible in these other material ways. So if you're curious about this, just continue listening, and you'll understand as it gets expanded upon in this conversation. So I really hope you enjoy it, and please do send me any feedback at my email if you would like, and you can reach out to Nikki as well through her website, which I'll have in my show notes. But let's go ahead and get to it, and happy listening. I'm sitting here with Nikki Hill and Sigh-Moon, and we're at the Tablelands in South Central Oregon, technically. Not Eastern Oregon, it's South Central.
Yeah.
It's the dry side.
Klamath
Basin area. Well, we're actually just down from the table, right? We're on your land that you caretake.
Yeah.
You can probably hear that motorcycle in the distance with this nice microphone we're
We can
using
all
right now.
hear the motorcycles.
And the cows, maybe. But we've been hanging out on the table. This is a place I've had not been before, but had heard a lot about from different people. So I've been excited to like get to explore with y'all both, and some of our other friends here this week, just seeing all these cool plants and how unique and special this place is. And so we've been just spending a lot of time, and but we're here because I also really just wanted to talk more with Nikki again. I know she's been on the podcast a couple times, but she recently just put out this really awesome survey publishing article, I guess you could call it. I mean, would you call it an article? I guess it was.
Yeah.
It's an article based on some really cool research she did this past year, and really for many years. And I wanted to just kind of get more into that for a little bit, and just have an organic conversation about it, and maybe get more people reading it and kind of tuned into what you've been thinking about with that. So yeah. So I guess
The article is such a multi-portal too, because it's got so much information in it and so many aspects to it that are an invitation, and it's got all those links at the bottom. I was just like, this is amazing. This is an amazing work.
Mm-hmm.
I was super grateful.
Yeah, what was the title of it? Was
Botany is Archaeology to Stop a Lithium Mine.
okay.
Mm-hmm.
Which we'll be talking a lot about different layers of how to think about all of that in this conversation today. So maybe we could start by I guess I have a bunch of questions written down, but maybe the order of how to even start approaching this conversation, we could start with like the article you wrote was about a survey you did at this particular place called Thacker Pass. So maybe we should set the stage a little bit of like where is this place? And why is it significant? Why is it a place that you felt was like significant enough to spend some time focusing on? You've been exploring Nevada for over a decade and like have been tuned into a lot of places in Nevada, but what about this place caught your attention and had you wanting to be a little more focused in and like do this survey?
Yeah, what's coming to mind to me is there setting up this conversation was where you were mentioning where we're sitting right now, and you said we're sitting below the table, and I think most people probably don't understand what that means. And tablelands is this type of topography that happens throughout the West. I'm sure it happens in other parts of the world too. But it's like these flat-topped mountains. And a lot of the time in the West, the flat-topped mountains have these very shallow soils, very rocky, and they're often these places that have a lot of the indigenous first foods on them. And this garden here, I call it a garden because of the densities of all of the first foods. This has been one of our teaching grounds. You know, this garden has been our teacher that we were introduced to from our mentor. And this is a place that started showing me patterns of kinship, of tended kinship of humans and plants. And so it's kind of from this example that some of those other patterns have been clarifying in my journeys over the past 10 years in the West. So I just wanted to explain what tableland is. There's lots of flat-topped mesas all the way from Oregon into Colorado, down into New Mexico. Down in New Mexico, they have the pueblos that people live on down there, and those are all big mesas as well, tabletops. There's a continuation of tended kinship in the West. It's not that it was just done in certain sites, although certain sites were more visited more often, and so that the plants will be more dense in places where people were spending more time, in part because the plants respond to that relationship. The evolution of the human and the plant was congruent. So a lot of these plants respond favorably to digging, especially done with intention and at the right time of year. And you start to be able to see this pattern everywhere. And so in some way, when I was setting out to do this walk at Thacker Pass, part of the sense I was having was that it's not about the rarity of a plant that makes something worth saving. It's kind of more about the commonality of the plants that people have a long history of kinship with, because that commonality is continuation, a woven continuation, and we're so used to looking at everything in fragments. And so I think that a part of the focusing on rarity of things comes out of that place of fragmentation. So part of my personal sense in wanting to do this was that there's the commonality that weaves it all together. So it's not just about the densities, it's just that those plants continue to appear everywhere in the West. Slightly different niches, slightly different micro-topographies, but you can start to see the patterns, and you can start to see the patterns of how they're there because of the human interaction as well. You know, I heard about the campaign for Thacker Pass almost 2 years ago when it started, a year and a half. And my attention was perked just because I had remembered being told by my mentor, Phoenicia Medrano, that was still a place where if you were traveling on foot or on horseback, that would be the corridor that you would be able to still find food and water traveling from eastern Oregon down into Nevada. And so that was that part of my interest in that, was understanding that was a place where people used to move through.
And she knew this because Native folks told her this information, and then her living on horseback in Nevada and eastern Oregon for so many years, that then became a real place that she used in such a way.
Yeah, she had direct experience with it, walking through on horseback and having her associations and interactions that she did to weave her understanding. I had actually never spent very much time in northern Nevada. I've spent more time in kind of central Nevada, the Hand of God Basin and Range area. So I wasn't exactly sure what to expect, because the patterns kind of change in different areas. You get smaller, bigger, slightly altered this way depending on where you are and what's going on with the topography and all that. But that was my interest, was just remembering her saying that. And so yeah, I went out just to kind of see what was going on there. I visited many times last year, and it was mostly later in the season, so it's hard to see some of these desert plants. They go dormant. That's part of their adaptation, kind of ephemeral. They live a long time, but they're able to make it in the desert by going into their starchy roots and hiding in there. So there could be no traces of them left by midsummer. So you may not even know the density of things that are going on if you're there in a different season. So, what was the rest of that question?
Well, what compelled you to go to Thacker Pass to look at the plants and to see what was there and to do this survey? I mean, I remember when we were talking on the phone last year and you were like, I don't know if I want to go, I'm not sure. You know, it was a big campaign happening there for a while. People camped, there's native elders, there's a lot going on in this like traditional activism kind of way of like, we're going to protect this place, we're here. Standing Rock vibes, you know, like kind of a smaller version of that happening there. And you're like, I don't know, like, do I want to come in and do I want to intrude? How do I want to approach this? Because I feel like I have a lot to offer and a lot of knowledge, but I also don't want to just come in and be like, I know. I remember you expressing that, like, not being sure how you want to approach, but you just kept feeling this curiosity of seeing, like, what was there, you know? And then you went, and then it just kind of, like, at least from what you told me afterwards, that you really were glad you went and started to have more of a relationship with that place and learning a little bit more about, like, why people were wanting to protect it. And maybe you could speak a little bit too. Maybe some people already know this and some people don't, but like what's happening at Thacker Pass, like why is it a place that's under threat and why would you care to like pay attention to what's there? You know, like the bigger part of that question is like defining. I mean, you're not one of the people like necessarily holding it down, like trying to do work in the legal system, trying to protect this place, or like you're not a native person who's like got a deep ancestral relationship with this place, but like what's happening there that needs our attention, I guess, too, in this.
Yeah, what's happening, and this was the other part of the personal desire to go out there, is that there's a proposed lithium mine, and lithium is a rare earth metal mineral that is used in storage, so used in batteries, all the rechargeable batteries for cars, for our solar batteries for charging our laptops, and
it's in this recorder right
for
now.
our phones and in our phones, and for all these things. And that's being touted as sustainable and as the thing that's going to get us off of fossil fuels. And that never has sat right with me. It didn't make sense because it still requires taking stuff out of the earth, and not just once, continually taking things from the earth. And I don't understand how that's sustainable if you're still talking about dealing with physical elements to begin with that wear out when you use them. And I don't like that we would get set on a path that isn't an actual answer. It's like the greenwashing, and you know, a lot of us feel that, you know, different pains and grief and trauma, whether we recognize it or not, from living in a culture that seems to be hell-bent on not actually sustaining itself in relation to the rest of the living world. So it's not a true answer. So that was my other reason for wanting to go out there, is that there's not a lot of people talking about how that's not actually very different than what we're doing already. And the other thing is that there's like 8,000 lithium claims that have come up in Nevada in the past couple of years. It's like a new gold rush. So just understanding from, seeing mines, traveling through the deserts, and knowing the history about some of them, that having that many claims, what that means is that whole mountain ranges disappear over time because the mines get bigger, and then you combine them for better efficiency for extracting. So you end up losing whole mountain ranges. And the deserts of the Great Basin are not places that most people think of going on vacation. They don't really spend any time or have any relationship to them. So they're assuming that there's not much happening out there. And it's just been some of the most nourishing places in my personal life has been spending time out here and getting to know these plants and understanding what they represent. They represent a life way that was based on kinship and mutual continuance. And I think that there's a potent medicine in there that if we lost, we would be really lost, and we need that medicine again. And this is the place that it was shown to me. So, that's a lot of claims if they all go through, and it's a little frightening because we're scrambling for an answer. And in that scrambling, we may not be paying attention to the actual true costs of what that is. So I was hoping to be able to help people see the life and the relationship that's going on out here. It's been going on forever. And I'm really just this person who fell deeply in love with these plants. I'm not a traditional person in most ways in my life at all. And I don't claim to have a full understanding, of course, of any of these things or any of those relationships, what the particular kinship was for particular people in the different areas. So the other part, part of my hesitancy that you were speaking to, me expressing, is I'm just like, I understand that, again, to come back to this idea of fragmentation, that's like a big thing that's going on in this culture. That's fragmentation of the landscape. Is also fragmentation of our own being and our own senses and understandings. And, the kinship and life ways of the different indigenous peoples who have the generational history with these plants. I do understand that understanding has been fragmented too, from the genocide and the intense separation from one's own homelands and land bases and all of those things. So the only hesitancy is that I understand I'm carrying a piece of something, but it's not mine, and it's only a piece of something. And just because I somehow in my life came into different circumstances where I was shown these things, that has been such a blessing and a nourishing gift for me to have in this one lifetime here. Doesn't mean that I'm trying to keep it as mine, So it's trying to have this like openness for understanding. We all have different pieces to bring in, Like I said, I really am just a person who fell in love with these plants and what they represent, and they've helped me with my own, sense of being here in this world, to have an example of something different than what's going on, which is disregard for plants being living beings, for plants, being anything other than decoration to surround your living. So I've been a plant lover a long time. So yeah, my hesitancy is just understanding that there's a lot going on in that fragmentation, and we're all trying to understand how to feel whole again, to have a whole understanding of how to have a living. So
when you came initially to Thacker Pass, you didn't really know what to expect, but were you able to, from the beginning, see right away some of these gardens and some of these plants, even I think it was the middle of summer when you went initially? And were there other people there paying attention to that exactly? And was that a bit part of the conversation of the campaign, or is this something that you feel like maybe was a little bit but not fully, or like was there an awareness of the plants there?
Yeah, there was some awareness. Like, people knew that Yampo was there. I had noticed Mariposa lilies.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the conversation, I think, was focused on it being gathering grounds, for plants and hunting. And
Burial grounds too? Some?
not burial ground, but there was two massacres that happened there. So in that way, a burial ground. Pahimaha is the people of Red Mountain word for that area, for Thacker Pass. And Pahimaha means rotten moon, because that's referring to the massacre that happened there and how the people were left there to rot after the massacre. So that's a big part of the story there for those people of Red Mountain. So yeah, there wasn't like a focus on what plants are there. Of course, there's like surveys that the lithium companies come out and do for the different endangered species, rare species kind of protocol stuff. You can find those. I've read them, but I have I don't know. That's one people with certain focus doing surveys. I think we need different surveys from different perspectives in order to get the full story of what's being taken away by doing these projects. And, I had some conversations with elders there, talking about where some of the medicine plants start to show up and, memories of them planting in those places. There's one elder talking about how they used to plant there because it holds the moisture a little bit longer in some of these rock areas. But there's much more conversations to be had, and that's a part of what I wanted with publishing the summary too. I did it just because I felt called to, but I'm just wanting to share that, and I would love to see the plants recognized as kin and as a reason for protecting a place that's in relationship, not just being rare, again, like I said. So part of publishing the article is really wanting other people's to come out with their voices and their memories of tending, methods for tending, places that they would bring things, how they would dig, times of year, all those things, so that can be a part of the conversation of belonging. Yeah, so it's an open invitation for wanting to hold space for those conversations to happen, because I just have one piece from spending time out there seeing these patterns.
Yeah, something that I was thinking about before this interview that I've been thinking about for a while and always consider, especially in like the kinds of landscapes that Thacker Pass and the Great Basin Desert, is this the framework that our culture in the U.S. is colonized by European ancestored peoples, around what is a good landscape is influenced by Eurocentric ideas of what is good and bad, what is a viable, fertile, or like appropriate garden, or like what is seen as worth being in relationship with in certain ways, and what's seen as like not a good landscape, and the way that the what's the word for it again they use, westward expansion, manifest destiny, right? Like the colonizing West as these white folks or European ancestor folks like approach new landscapes, how they conceptualize what relationships could be had with those places was encountered with the framework coming from a place that was very different in a lot of ways, and like often deserts are considered places that aren't, that there's like an inability to understand how to be in relationship with deserts a lot of the time, because it feels like a scary place. It's very open and big and expansive and quiet,
and like deafeningly quiet, and like often there's not a lot of trees, or if there are trees, they're really small trees. You know, like we're in a juniper forest right now, but it's like not a big tall forest of trees. You know, it's you're exposed. It feels like a void. It feels there's and the way that those lands were approached was often just with confusion and fear, and that's translated into our current relationships with a lot of these landscapes, you know, I think, and especially the Great Basin. I was mentioning to you before we got on air, and you too, Sigh-Moon, earlier, just like this book I read a while ago called The Void, the Grid, and the Sign. I forget the author, but I'll put it in the show notes. It's about the Great Basin, and it's like this archaeologist, or I think he's an archaeologist, maybe I'm wrong about that, but he's just like anthropologist, archaeologist, artist person talking about like conceptualizing big spaces, especially on Turtle Island, and how we can't quite, as European ancestored people who are like dominate our culture, can't quite figure out how to relate to this landscape. And the first maps drawn of the Great Basin Desert were not being, no one knew how to draw the basin on the maps. You know, the Sierras and the Salt Lake, Big Salt Lake, were kind of put really close to each other. A couple of the little mountain ranges in the Toyabe were like put in, 3 of them, you know, lined up, but then it was like, we don't know what to do with the rest of it. And often deserts, especially like a desert like that, is considered like a no man's land, which is kind of a really weird way to label any piece of land, or like a wasteland. You know, and Nevada's famous for being like places where they test nuclear bombs, and like all kinds of weird shit happens in Nevada we don't even know about. There's tons of other mines there, you know, already. It's just seen as a place where we can extract. It's like the inversion of, like, we're putting lithium into cars that we can drive around, and it's like inverting the earth to continue our culture, and that place is seen as a place, it's okay to invert the earth here. Like, it's okay to, like, pull all this out here and like, expend it for our cultural use, because it's not really valuable. According to the framework, the lens that we're all seeing from, even us that are aware, that's just a part of everything around us, you know. And we all like know, because we've been trying to pay more attention, that there's so much more going on in these places. And, you know, like indigenous peoples who have ancestral relationships with these places for a really long time, like obviously know the value and the story and the like culture, the beauty of these places, you know. And like figuring out how to encourage people to have like more of a relationship, or more of a reevaluating their sense of value around these places is tricky. And like you said, like the need to figure out a solution as we're running out of these other fossil fuels, as we're hitting places and like what's happening in our culture where we're feeling a direness, it feels suddenly a little bit more okay, right, to blow up all these mountains in Nevada, because we don't see it as valuable enough to save, you know. And even if it is culturally significant to certain peoples, like, well, it's a sacrifice to keep living the way we're living.
This might be a good point to bring up, like, part of the mantra of the modern culture is like lesser of two evils in so many ways. So we've somehow internalized that, believed it, and decided that there has to be sacrifice zones in order for us to have our culture. We've forgotten that there's other ways of doing that, of having a life way that doesn't deplete things. And so that's the problem with a new technology coming out claiming to not be doing that when it's doing the same thing. We're still coming from the same perspective of use. That it's not about relationship. Use is a very short-sighted relationship value. Use implies that you use something up. And, you know, deserts are like these great distilling zones. You know, they're like distilling the essence of things in the desert, because so much time goes by there with just like building up of minerals and stuff like that. And there's something about the dryness that's distilling those things.
I mean, even the plants have more essential oils and more.
I think of when I was doing dry farming. When I was doing small-scale farming, we did a lot of dry farming in the Pacific Northwest. And so that was all about like timing of getting the plants out so the roots could go down before the water table, like they could be following the sinking water table so that the roots would be in there. And then you wouldn't have to water all season. And the vegetables that you harvest from there, they keep longer because they have a higher mineral content. Like adding water diffuses the mineral concentration, makes things more succulent. They have less minerals in them when they're like that. So we would have like, kale that would last, in a cool place of the trailer for weeks. That's how you know you have a high mineral content in your vegetables, is how long they store. So that's all this concept of dryness distilling properties. And before we were so focused on agriculture, we were eating perennial foods that had a long life in their environment before we consumed them. So we had like higher nutrition going on too, just from that distillation process of the dryness. Not having all of the resources all the time. Like a part of us thinks that more is better all the time. Like that's how we do our agriculture. That's how we do our energy consumption. Like we can't imagine not using the same amount of energy as we've come to be used to now. That's a part of the thing that's missing from the conversations about peak oil and all that stuff. Is that we're like, we got to find a solution, but we're not talking enough about, do we really need to be using this much energy all the time for what? What are we using it for?
Definitely not public transportation.
Yes.
Bitter.
So the other thing that's just occurring to me is, the Sagebrush Sea is that term for these unmappable big vastnesses that connect mountain ranges, in the West. And again, it's that connection has value beyond measure. We need these different places to be connecting the wetter places, We need these places in between that, look like the same rolling hills to connect the mountains. It's that continuity, So I think that the other thing in the conversations about not understanding what's going on in the deserts is we're fractionated. We're like still looking in fragments. We're looking at square plots of land, and we apply that same background belief and understanding in everything we look at. So we still have this agricultural square plot mindset that we apply in ecology, and that we apply in the background, even if we're not consciously thinking about it, and do all of our applications of getting our needs met. Oh, we can get that over there, and that over there, and that over there, and we're not seeing how they're all connected. Can't see how if I do all this work to drain that wetland down there so that I can plow it and put in hay. And then I try to get the water back on there. The water I just took off, now I need it to water. But we start to disconnect that process of recharge, So that actually less water starts to be coming down that river because you disrupted the soil layers there. You're not allowing that to be percolating in the valleys and the wetlands anymore. Your source is eventually going to dry up. Like it really is all connected. We're not talking about, like, just to take the example of like a water system, it's not always talking about above ground water. It's talking about the overall movement, which is through the soil, which is through these dry lands. There's so many springs in the desert. And the other thing, you're talking about people coming out west couldn't make any sense of it. The other reason is that it's that mindset of thinking that you can have everything you need on one piece of land. That you can have water on every patch of desert landscape in order to have your crops.
The same thing on 80 acres in the west that you could do on 80 acres in the east. So everybody got their 80 acres and a mule, but they could be getting 80 acres of something totally, completely different, and they didn't know what to do with it,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So part of that is like that settled comfort too. They should be able to settle in one place and get everything. And again, that's ignoring the continuity of how we need the whole Earth and the whole region to be in balance and functioning together to have the needs of everybody met. Humans, animals, others, you know.
Yeah, that book that I was mentioning earlier, The Void, The Grid, and the Sign. The grid piece, it's talking about like the concept of gridding land that we feel fearful of, or gridding lots of land. We grid the flattest places, the most desertous places. You look at the maps, they're way more gridded out than the places that aren't flat, right? But the gridding is like this an attempt at trying to order what we consider chaos in the minds of people, not understanding how to relate to a place, and that somehow through that gridding it's easier to navigate the 20 miles between that range and this range and the basin you have to traverse through, like, but we sacrifice a lot by doing that, you know. And I think a lot about like private land ownership and the grid and how it gets in the way a lot of like really accomplishing the bigger picture of what we're really needing to do. But we already live in it so deeply. It's like a framework as well that we live in so deeply. Like, how the heck do we pull ourselves out of that, you know? I mean, just needing to have a private place that you own that you still have to pay to continue to own to be able to just exist as a human and feel secure or something. And the sea of other squares, that's a problem in all of this too. And really being able to fully understand the flow, like you might be able to restore or take care of or like respect and be in relationship with the Yampa gardens or like the sagebrush on the plot that you have control over, but your neighbors don't, then their water draining could affect the way your Yampa grows, and then they're all gone. It's like, yeah, I think often not being able to realize what effect one thing is going to have on the thing next to it. I mean, in something like Thacker Pass, there's so many implications for it, just like in Manifest Destiny and Lewis and Clark coming west up the Missouri River, the implications of that journey, even though it seemed like a small thing, right? Like these people coming out just to see what was there and like survey and, you know, send back information. But the implications of that journey was huge. Just like we can imagine something like this mine, which is supposed to be pretty big, right? Like it's supposed to be one of the bigger ones, you know, I think. And
They say it's the largest lithium deposit in North America. Yeah.
Well, and just how, I mean, with respect to what we've already done and how most people don't realize how devastating where we're at right now has been and is to our population, and how that giant mine would affect LA or Portland, Oregon, or San Francisco. Like the idea that all these things are connected and that they are going to be affecting Portland. They're going to be affecting Portland and LA and San Francisco, large population areas. And it's kind of like, but it's in the basin and that's this drainage, but how these minerals, even what they do to the balance of our electromagnetic reality, we just don't know. And it's so interesting because science doesn't seem to have a big curiosity for those things, which is too bad because I'm not a scientist, because I'd be curious, but there's these brilliant minds who are like overlooking all these aspects that I wonder about.
the web of how that particular thing is, that system that they're studying so intently is connected to this
huge web. Like how lithium, what it's going to do to us. Like what lithium just taking it out and spreading it out. Not bad or good or disaster, abundance, but just that affects everything. And then that super sacred place with this huge gold mine of lithium. I mean, if we remove it, what's going to... people are like, oh, let's just take out this brick from this dam. It's like, oh no, the whole city's flooding. I'm like, maybe they were there for a reason.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when I was at Oak Flat, that same conversation was being had about one of the largest copper mines. They want to open pit copper mines. They want to put in how it'll affect like so many different things, and how it feels like such a small person against a giant. You know, like fighting to save something that you can never replace. There's these. Sometimes they say that they can. Once they're done, they're like, we'll put the soil back. We met this guy in Nevada when we did a walk in July who was from Elko, near Elko where we were, who said he worked in the mines, and then Elko is like this town in central North Nevada that the main economy is mining. He was like, and being employed to measure these piles of what do they call it?
Slag?
Tailings slag.
Yeah.
Figuring out how to use survey equipment to like measure these things, and then they
see if it's safe enough to replant on. And
they were like trying to like put it back and make soil layers again to replant on it, and put like plastic down and then plant in the plastic so that it like didn't emit radioactive material, and like the plastic somehow was going to help. And like he's like, well, they're trying. He was kind of against the mines at the same time. He's like, well, it is what it is. And I'm like, you can't put that back. You can't like take something apart and put it back together in the same way it was. That's not how it works. You can't restore. I mean, you think about landscape restoration with thinking about plants as well. Like they try to do it that way. They try to just put all the pieces back the same way it was, the way they imagine it was. And it doesn't work that way.
Yeah, there's like a denial. There's like a denial and a self-hatred that's part of the denial, some internalized self-hatred, that one, it's like two sides of the same coin. One, that we have this crazy effect and, we're just horrible. We always suck. So that's why we always have to choose the lesser of two evils, because our life way is just going to be destructive any which way we do it to the rest of nature. And nature's separate than us. That's a part of that thread. Or that like, it's not that big of a deal. Like we should be able to do all these things and the rest of nature should be able to stay stable. Like you hear this in a lot of the restoration conversations, or in that mentality, not even talking about the field, but that we're like, oh, this different kind of vegetation is coming in, and it's not just about that subject, but inherent in that is ignoring that the way that we live our lives and the things that we remove out of the relationships they're in to the soil they're in, and move them around and concentrate them over here, different elements of life, has an effect. It changes things. It changes what is possible there. It changes who can continue showing up. It changes what can live there. It changes what water is drinkable. Like, these things have long-term lasting effects. We're a part of nature. We have an effect in everything that we do. And it's not saying that to be afraid to do anything. It's an invitation to step back into that consciously. But I think a part of these sacrifice zone conversations are only possible because we see ourselves as separate than it, and there is inherent in that a denial that we actually have an effect. And that's part of the thing in bringing about the conversation of the plants as living archaeology, is to see that their densities are a part of a relationship with humans. There was an effect there. There's a reason why they're so dense. It was a relationship. A beneficial one. Those plants got to evolve and have more abundance and hold the deserts together because of the human relationship. We had a place that fit there. Beautifully, harmoniously, reciprocally, And
we fit. Like we're an essential part of the environment.
Yeah.
A very wonderful part of the earth.
Yeah.
It's like we don't get told that.
No. And then we go around in circles trying to make everything stay the same, even though we're doing all these things. Like most of Nevada, it's already had so many rushes. Gold rush, silver rush, name it.
Placer mining. It's amazing.
Clear cutting all of the foothills. Like,
we don't even know what it looks like. I mean, everything we're speaking to on the surface is very changed from the last 200 years. Like, we never have seen any. I mean,
No.
this place has changed in the last 40 years so drastically.
Yeah.
The
Yeah,
particular
there's-
place where we sit right
Like
now.
where we're sitting right here, when I talk to people who are a little older than me, they're like, oh, well, the berries used to be way more abundant and things were so much different. And you can see, like this place I've cleared so much, but just the size of the sagebrush and the size of the I call it buckbrush, but just so many things. There were huge things and have just been making their bodies into biochar, but I mean, there were gigantic sagebrush that are dead because of the shifting water tables and just the reality of what we're doing to the valley floor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's all continuous, and especially you have climate changing, things are desiccating anyways. But we've been compromising the relationships of all those things so that it's a little exacerbated. Like maybe it's not, maybe like a way we could grasp for, because that's part of the, the impetus for digging up a bunch of lithium is for climate change, right? That's become this, we got to fight it.
That is just, wow.
So, but maybe instead of like trying to grapple with this disembodied idea of like the climate changing, which is this huge thing. That's why I say disembodied. Like, how are you supposed to hold that in your body and in your daily choices? And I mean, it's a lot to ask for, right? But maybe a more approachable part is understanding the continuity of flow in the environment of all the different elements of water, of soil building, of all those things. So it's like, if you start to look at it as like a big picture on the ground, which is where humans belong. That's the creature we are. Is we actually belong on the
dirt.
ground. We have a long history. All of our ancestry has history with understanding that.
Yeah.
Is that like we're looking at this valley down here, and in the deserts especially, that's where all the agriculture happens. We have no idea what it looked like before. I mean, I don't. Some people will have a memory of that. But like this river down here has this beautiful, sinuous, structure still. But it's been highly altered. A lot of the time when they alter rivers, they make them straight and disconnect the water channel from the surrounding landscape. And that starts to dry out the surrounding landscape. It needs to be connected in order for this hill to have water to keep that sagebrush alive.
Boom.
That needs to be able to move and percolate. But what they did down there, even though they kept the sinuosity, there's still all these square grid shapes on there.
The grid imposed on a non-gridded landscape that isn't naturally gridded.
But I think that some of the sinuosity was done because they're like, first of all, we got to drain it so that we can plant hay, and it was a wetland, so we can't get the plow in there. So then they do all these trenches to drain it, and then everybody has their different parcels, and everybody wants some water, so they've got to keep it there. Some of that's like manufactured or created, human-created sinuosity,
Yeah.
right? So that doesn't and they did a lot of work to disconnect it from the surrounding lands because they wanted a drier field in the wetland. So it's got the sinuosity, but only so that it can touch more of those square properties.
Yes.
So everybody gets some.
It's like a road.
That wasn't done for habitat considerations. It was done to be able to reach every square property, So that's disconnected from the rest of the water table. It doesn't have that continuity. So that's why the hills start drying up. So we don't have to think about the ambient temperature of climate change. We could start to work just with that, Like you guys both know, but I really got into the beaver conversation because that was the first thing that altered so many things here before colonization was the removal of all the beavers. We wouldn't have had arable land to have agriculture if colonization hadn't removed all the beavers first. That's how wet of a place it was, even in these deserts.
The Klamath Basin was one of the largest marshes in the western world area of Turtle Island. I mean, it was so phenomenal when I just pick up some stupid black and white magazine being like, look what we did. And it's just phenomenal how it's unbelievable how much water there was here.
Yeah.
And there still is. That's what people don't know. But just how much we've altered the valley floors of the lowest point in the water table, the aquifers being charged.
Yeah.
And moving up the mountains. Because like you said, people don't realize that water charges upwards.
A lot further than you would think.
Yeah, like
Not-
all the way, bottom to top.
Yeah.
And it's almost like, what?
That's
But
how you have a spring on top, is that it's saturated enough below.
so much, all the way up the
that
steps.
straw works.
Until it spouts out of the mountain, like, water everywhere.
Yeah.
And then it flows back down, sinks as it goes, is checked by the beavers, who are just, there was 5,000 beavers, like, just right over here.
There's
in a
400
section-
million in North America.
400 million beavers. I mean, just, it's so beautiful, creatively, imaginatively, conceptually thinking, 400 million beavers, like, what would that look like?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how much water would be down here? What would the birds be like? What would come to habitate here? Like, how would we evolve with that?
Yeah.
People are like, mosquitoes. And I'm like, yeah, but we're evolved in this place and we're used to them. They don't even like after a while, they don't even like me anymore. They're just like, whatever.
Well, and the funny thing about mosquitoes is they often follow agriculture and urbanization,
Right.
actually,
They
because
weren't
then
even
you have
here
those really
before.
shallow cement areas everywhere that hold water. And hoof prints. I mean, that's more of their habitat than other things. Of course they exist in wetlands, yes. But
But moving, flowing marsh water wouldn't be like their ideal.
yeah, they might have more ideal things in this setup than that one. We don't know, right?
They're just reminding us. They're like, hey, silly humans. Do you like us?
We're here just to annoy you.
It's perfect.
Yeah.
Wake up, wake up, wake up.
Moving plants around the room, change the scenery, explore the view. Things are growing within you. Things are dying without you. Moving fish live in the sea, staying same, survive the day. Needles swimming around me, things are dying within me, and you are sunflowers on your gown. Push limits have reached their bounds. Now we bind into our grieving. I laughed inside the waiting room while the flowers I brought you wilted, and you are sunflowers on your
I'd love for you to speak a little bit more to this concept of botanical archaeology and maybe how you feel it was reflected at Thacker Pass. I mean, obviously, being here at the Tablelands, it's here as well. It's like everywhere. This is really actually just a lens that so many of us don't know to see through, because some people don't even know one plant, much less 10 or 100 or whatever. And not knowing these people, whether you know the name or you just know the essence of this plant, is a really big barrier as well to not being able to see this. But it's, often these places are advocated for, or people are talking about protecting them more because there's burials, or there's like other kinds of concepts of archaeology in these places, or it's a sacred site, which is really difficult for Western culture to be able to. You have a lot of this culture war clash happening, but like this idea that there's these culture clashes of like, this is a sacred place, it's worth saving, and then you've got these people being like, well, prove it's sacred. Mm-hmm. In this way that we see things, like prove that you have that you did ancestral practices, or like you have like cultural practices you do here. Prove that there's this, this is real. And they're like, we don't really believe you, or that didn't really happen, or like, it's not that big a deal, it's not that important. And it's like, well, figuring out how to fight against that mind frame is difficult. And I think, archaeology is like, there's bones there, there's an old building site or whatever. We see the remnants, which is only like a percentage of the remnant of the life that was there. It's what was physically left, right? But the plants, what's so interesting about thinking about plants through this lens that is so often not considered. I mean, this is something we've talked about on the podcast a lot with different people over the years, is like, how do you start to re-see, if you're taking all these things in consideration, we're not separate from nature. As people moving on the landscape historically, we were in relationship with plants in such a way that we co-evolved with them. They changed us, we changed them, we changed the water, we changed the ways that things moved and morphed and shifted, and it did the same to us. Like, it's not actually a crazy thing to like really think about when you look at it. How could that not have happened, actually? But in the framework we're looking through now, it's almost like it's almost seen as a myth or something. Mm-hmm. Totally. So maybe you could speak a little bit to this, because I think it's a really important thing, and it's something I'm just trying to grasp with what I'm doing too in the world, and like how to explain this to people when you're trying to talk to them about anthropogenic landscapes or wild tending, or land tending, or like why it's important to be a human that like acts in the land in a certain way is all related to this. Yeah, maybe you could speak to how you think that we should look at botanical archaeology, and then also how that applies to Thacker Pass and your survey there.
Yeah, I think the first barrier in understanding that is that, how do I put this? We still have this human superiority complex. So when we think about ways to prove that humans had something to do with it, we're thinking of physical objects that humans did on their own. They did this thing. They built this pot. That's their bones. We built this building. We channelized that thing. And then we have the idea of wilderness as something that, has nothing to do with humans, except we go and take things from there sometimes. And that was also a part of the misinformed story of hunter-gatherer cultures, just hunting and gathering, that they weren't also very sophisticated in their tending, and that they weren't just going and taking what they needed and not having any concern for otherwise, that they were a mutual participant in that. And so I think that's the main barrier. It's still this separation, and still the superiority thing, that humans did that. Instead of, this was a co-collaboration with topography, with water movement, with the plants themselves, with the other animals who also do things in that landscape. So I think that's hard. That's one reason why it's difficult to really illustrate and even talk about this, and maybe that's part of why it's not talked about very often, is it's not just that humans planted that, humans did that. It's that it was a co-collaboration at all levels. So yes, you can absolutely see patterns and find cues to start to take note of, to GPS, to start to collect data on, of where you can see some of these patterns where there's like rock flows that are puzzle pieced together and loaded with food, with these food plants. Yes, humans did that. You start to get the eye for it. You could start to walk around the landscape and point it out, collect data. There's also other formations that humans had some part in that weren't about planting for their lifeway that you can still see today, you know? And there are more people talking about this. There's different ethnobotanists and archaeologists doing these things, and I'm looking forward to connecting with them and studying up on it some more. Talk about the Amazon with the terra preta soils. It was compost from humans, you know? So a lot of these things were done just as it wasn't done in an imposition way. It wasn't done in I'm going to plant this field in corn. I'm going to impose that there. I'm doing this. It was these plants seem to like to grow in these ways, and if I dig them here and leave the rocks on the surface, then there are more places for the seeds to go. I'm going to put some seeds in there. Then when I come back, I can pull 20 out of that one spot instead of one. The plants love it. Humans love it. Easy done. But it was just a general way of living with that in mind of reciprocity and continuance. It wasn't this imposition that I'm going to get this to do this every time. Not in relation or consideration with what else was going on. Like, I'm not going to try to plow that rocky tableland to put in a field. This is the difference of mindset. I'm going to look at where the little water drainages are up on that flat top, understanding something about the individual plant I'm working with and the nature of them. This one kind of likes to have wet feet in the spring. We're not talking about desert plants, right? So we're not talking about wetland. But that one likes slightly wetter feet, the Yampa. I'm going to put her in the drainages because that's where she wants to be anyways. So can I actually claim that I did that? Or that I'm responding to something? I'm responding to some relationship. And yes, you can see my fingerprint in there. You know, you could see generations of fingerprints out there on the landscape of that relationship. Can I prove that it was only there because of humans? Wow, you're asking a lot. And only because we're still coming from that same concept that of the superiority thing. That's worth protecting if humans did it. That's why we leave all those rusty cans in the middle of the forest from those camps. You're not supposed to pick them up because it's archaeological evidence.
I didn't know that.
You're not supposed to pick those up. I don't know why I would want one other than to make a lantern. But but you know, but there was also like so many people were nomadic peoples. Like we tend to focus on the settled archaeology too. And a lot of the peoples, especially in the desert areas, were nomadic. Means they didn't spend time building buildings and even doing pottery a lot of the time. So you don't have those things left to remind you of that relationship and that ancestry there in that landscape. What you do have is the gardens. Because that was their life way here, was moving around and planting. And knowing that they keep coming to this place over generations. Great-grandmother used to go there. That's where they told me to go. And I'm going to listen to them because I know they planted food for me 20 years ago. You know? I know we've been doing that every year we go through there. That's some beautiful, beautiful consideration. One that's not trying to impose or push anything. But so, yes, they're nomadic peoples. You're not going to have the same things you go looking for. So it depends on the bias you start looking for. If you're looking for pottery shards and don't find any, you're not going to see anything worth saving there. You know? If you can start to see the gardens, you might start to understand. There might be some relationship fingerprint there that we actually need to learn something from, to remember something from. You know? So that's a part of the understanding there. It's just there's not always going to be those solid objects to understand what's been going on. Yeah.
And Thacker Pass is one of those places where you feel there are remnants, or they're not remnants, but full. I mean, remnants is used in a way of like as if there's just fragments of what was. Maybe that is true, and maybe it isn't, but like that it's full of these gardens, and like you said earlier in the conversation, given that it's such a key geological feature between two regions as like a main corridor that humans could travel through, like if there's not a lot of other options, it gives a lot of reason to believe especially that there would be gardens there
given that, like, why would people want to walk through and travel through an area for weeks on end that they couldn't eat from? And so the impetus for erasing and blowing up and, like, inverting a place that was
So important.
a bridge to get from this place to the next, full of food that got left there for the next round of people to come through or to come back through the next part of the season, I think is huge. Because, you know, just like you've spoken to me before about, like, other things in the Great Basin that we have to think about, like why there's no bears in Nevada anymore, practically. Maybe there's a few, but not like it used to be, you know, like, and how then not having bears affects the ecology, not having beavers affects the ecology. And part of that too is, like, the fragmentation through the gridding, through all these ways of not seeing the place as valuable that has cut off the food. In a place like that, especially the Basin and Range, even more so than other landscapes, and other landscapes have their own set of problems and issues in this way, where you pull out a thing that you didn't think was a big deal, but then it became a bigger deal. But the Basin and Range is this place, these sky island ecologies intermixed with this sometimes alkali, but like these big basin open sagebrush seas, you know. The having food in the right places means that you can move through that place and thrive, you know. And I mean, so if we don't live that way anymore, like, what's the point, right? Or like, that's in the past, so what's the point? Or like, but the point is that it's like, what is the point? I mean, maybe you could speak to that. Like, what's the point? What's the point of caring? You know, like, what's the point of going and finding these gardens and, like, bringing it to people's attention, you know?
Well, okay, the point is that whether you're paying attention or not, agriculture is not actually panning out that well. What is it? There's rivers in Italy that are drying up. What was it? What was that?
The river in France right now is,
Yeah.
I mean, all over Europe.
Big rivers. I can't remember their names right now. I have too much information in my head, but these
Doesn't
big
matter.
rivers, the Nile River Valley is drying out. That's a huge one. That's the agricultural, like, seat. That's the womb of agriculture. That's one of them over there. It's drying out. It's not farmable anymore. It hasn't been that long. And we have to adapt in different ways, and agriculture isn't the only way. So that's the importance, is you have kids. You like this idea of humans being able to continue in some way. We're still here living. That's the point. We're still here now.
Yeah.
Because we're here now. And because these systems were, first of all, not the only system ever granted. It hasn't been that long. We've had the plow. And secondly, it's failing.
It's
Like, I
failing.
think the U.S. doesn't even have back stock of food anymore.
No.
Like, that was a part of the gluten allergies, maybe, was they released a bunch because the wheat crop failed miserably. And so maybe they had moldy wheat that went out into the system. You know, like, there's so many threads you could follow to see what's going on, because it's not always talked about openly because we're afraid. And then the system's afraid to really just talk about these
Somebody's
things.
going to come after us for feeling like a
We're gonna
lithium
blame
mine
each
shouldn't
other
be
and-
there.
Well, it's vulnerable.
It's
so
very vulnerable.
And
It's-
nobody wants to starve.
Nobody
But
wants
the thing
to
is,
starve.
people are miserable.
Yeah.
And the word abundance comes up so much in the new age communities, and the, like, we're making lots of money with our mindsets and all these different class realities. And it's so interesting because enjoyment of life has been radically demonized. And the idea of abundance already around us, and the joy of just being able to see, like, when we go and look at the Yampa, and we're all freaking out. We're like, oh my God, it's so thick and beautiful, and it's everywhere. I mean, we are so blessed to just have eyes to see that. And that's what people don't get. That we could just have this simple reality that could be super abundant and super joyful. Work 8 hours a week, 12 hours a week to subside, quote unquote, that weird word, when people are just working their lives away, which is what the plan is. But, like, we could be so free You know, liberty, justice, freedom for all. It's like that's the true depth of this beautiful Turtle Island to me that I've been shown through all this, is just how funny it is that when we crack open the soil and pop the little biome open and put 300 seeds in there from 3 different tops of the little yampas, we just planted 300 yampas. We barely disturbed anything. If anything, we just made it kind of do a little die off and grow back really fast. It's not like plowing.
Yeah, so the agriculture is failing in lots of ways. And the other part that you're speaking so eloquently to, that I was thinking, is that we have a place of collaboration at the table with the rest of life still.
Boom.
That's why to bring it back up. We have so many messages about how we suck and everything's failing and what are we supposed to do about it.
There's
And
no
it's
way
like,
out.
It's not, the answer isn't to freak out. Like, we've been taken care of as the human species in so many different ways. And we tend to forget, and it's a burden, that it's not all up to us. And the rest of the world is here making a life way and adapting and adjusting in ways that you couldn't imagine, but that you can participate in. So if we step back into that relation, whatever avenue, whatever foothold you have, to start re-entering into that avenue of relating to the rest of your world as a living, participating garden that you are absolutely a part of, I think that would change so many things. At the personal and the bigger perspective. The point is for us to re-engage. Like, we got to this place where we're not engaging directly. We have all these different things brought to us, and so of course we're like, what's the point? Because we feel totally disempowered and separate from all of it. And we never go out to any of these places to feel what it is there and have our own experience of what that is. Like, it's one thing for me to tell you what I think you could find out here. It's a completely different thing for you to come find out for yourself. For you to be given that space, a place at the table, and be like, this world is our world as anybody else's. You know, how do we want to tend it? We need everybody engaged again to be able to have that conversation. Otherwise, it's just ideologies. And that's how we can sit back and listen to the stories of things falling apart and listen to this weird lady talking to you about how you should go understand how much life is in the desert and be like, yeah, whatever. It's because it's just words. It's just an idea, you know? So it's an invitation to come back out and participate. Especially, even if you want to accept the idea that, well, we need sacrifice zones, you should at least go see what the sacrifice zone looks like first. That's what I think. I think you should know what's being taken away so that at least you have that connection. At least you have that, because that's worth something too. Even having the grief of what's being taken away is worth something for your livingness, for your fucking soul.
Yeah, for our sense of being.
If you never see what disappears, you have no map. You have no compass for where you might want to go. And I think we would all maybe benefit from feeling invited to that again.
Because we are.
Yeah. And on a personal level, I don't want you all making decisions about what you're doing with landscapes that I love. I want you to come visit before you tell me you're going to dig it up. That's what I would like. You know? I'd be happy to show you around.
It's interesting thinking about the concept of this idea of botanical archaeology in a place like that. You know, it's more information to put in the pool of like, protect this place because of this. Maybe we could create laws around this. Maybe we could like pull this into some officialness.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not just about like having more evidence. This is a reason why you should protect it. It's also like, hey, maybe this is more important than the lithium itself, like in this conceptual or in this like real way that it is in our lives. Like, pay attention to this. This is actually a missing piece in so many campaigns, I feel like, that are around like environmental activism. There is often, I mean, sure, like in Appalachia, people I know doing environmental activism there, they're like, well, there's all these woodland medicinals that habitat loss and this and that, but there's still often not a conversation being had from this framework of living botanical archaeology. It's like, well, these are rare plants, or these are plants that only grow in this place, but that link is still often missing in that world, in that framework. You know, all of us could call ourselves activists in some way, but we're not really like involved in these like things like in that sense of the way that you call yourself that in our culture now, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm often like noticing how there's missing pieces like that. And I think you going there and just adding that conversation is not just like, yeah, like I said, this is not just more evidence. Here's a lens that might change why we even think we should be pulling lithium out in the first place. Like, maybe we don't need it.
Yeah, it's
Maybe
all
we
of it.
don't need it.
Or maybe we have enough because the misconception is that it's need-based to continue this life way, but it's really profit-based. There's way more stuff being produced than needed, even for you and I to each have a cell phone.
And we're not profiting.
No.
That's the thing, is like, people, we're not profiting. We're getting played. It's the corporations that have personhood
Yeah.
with these people in them,
And creating obsolete technology.
getting huge amounts of money, and then us with our cell phones or our batteries or whatever we're using, feeling bad, feeling good, whatever. We're not actually profiting from these mines. We're going to be very harmed.
Yeah, and people living there. I mean, all the mines are foreign companies too. That's a part of how it's set up, though. It's set up systemically that way because if you have a connection to place, there's no way that you would actually do those things. Like, I'm not going to dig up a mine in my backyard where I have my grandkids. I'm not going to do that. Maybe where you have your grandkids, I don't care. Right? That's the idea, though. The only way that works is that you have foreign companies, foreign workers, too. A lot of the logging industry has workers that live nowhere near that area. Because you wouldn't do those things to your own place.
Or people feel like they have no choice. I mean, in Appalachia, in the coal country, there are people who have been living there for 6 generations that the only work that they ever can
Have opportunity.
is coal
Yep.
mines. But at the same time, what's been taken from them is their power because
Yes.
of the manipulation of these companies and being connected to the lands
Yeah.
that their ancestors took from indigenous peoples, or maybe coexisted with indigenous peoples. And same kind of thing, like in Elko when we were there and we met that guy who was like maybe 22 years old or something, and it's like, well, this is 90% of the employment in Elko.
Yeah, we start to give up some of our own, the own validity of our own senses and responses to things because we're in this place where we feel like there's no other options. So part of these things too is a call to re-engage. Because if we look at the idea of use, right? So the Forest Service is supposed to be land of many uses, right? Mining would be the ultimate use. There's no other use if you do that one. There's no other use possible. And
Yeah.
so I really dislike the language of use because I think that it's a very sterilized, dead way of describing a relationship. It's not even describing a relationship.
No.
But if we start using these lands to reintegrate our relations to them, that has an effect. That's playing with that language, because at its heart, it's real. If you take off subsistence lifeways opportunities from the landscape, and you put in these other uses, a part of that is because deep down we all understand that we can't be disconnected from land and from relating to it and from consuming and all the reciprocity and whatever that goes with that. You can't actually separate that. There has to be these other things put on top of it in order for something else to not be happening. So if we all could understand that our direct engagement with the landscape, through our foraging, through our tending, through our simple living on the landscape, with the landscape, in the landscape, together, doing things, that would unwind a lot of that shit. A lot of that possibility for being able to come in and do something like that would be taken away if we were re-engaged in those ways, in a real way, in a big way, you know? That's something that the indigenous cultures understand. They haven't been separated from it for that long here. Our ancestors were separated a long time ago. So we can play with some of these weird ideas of use and stuff, turn them back into our own integrated sense of belonging. That's the other thing I would love to see from this. So we take our place back in these places. Instead of getting to the place where we feel small and isolated and we have to get our needs met from this place of disconnection. And so we end up compromising ourselves and our own senses to do things, to take jobs, to adopt ideas, to let parts of our soul die in order to get along. You know? Because the same way in which the earth starts to die and senesce, we do in ourselves. It's not separate things. It's the same process. It's the same exact process. One's not possible without the other one. That's how integrated and connected we are.
I've been thinking about that a lot. The somatic internal landscape is a mirror for the outer, and like, it's one thing to just talk about it,
Yeah.
like this, but it's another thing to be actually starting to become more and more aware of like the multi-layers of those mirrors. You know,
Yeah,
inside your
Feels a
own
bit like calamity.
your own ecology, the ecology between humans together, and the complexities and how it's so fucked up, and then how our nervous systems are like
Dysregulated.
the mycelial that's fucking poisoned, you know, and then if we co-evolved with plants, which we did, then our nervous systems are evolved to be co-regulative with plants in the land. I mean, that's like scientifically proven. Even the scientists can measure that. I can't explain that away, though, when it comes down to trying to think about relating to a place like Thacker Pass. They're going to bring that up. That layer up, you know.
Well, I think that's the layer we'll be getting to, you know. But in the meantime, to think of it in an absolute benevolent perspective, we're all here teaching each other language. So we're teaching the mining companies language, too. Like, that's a part of our power. We're all in this together. None of us are getting out of here without feeling the same toxicity. Nobody. So we're also bringing language in. But in the meantime, it's baby steps. So we use words to help get there, you know, and an understanding to help get there. The plants are the living archaeology of humans. That's our kin and our relation. That needs to be understood. Otherwise, it's all fragmented. And that's not hippie weirdness. You know, I took GPS points and pictures, and I'm totally game for doing it the absolute scientific collecting data, putting points on a map thing. But it has to be done together with stories, with people's remembrance, people's stories of tending, what they understand, for everybody to have that sharing. Those things go together, they're not separate. And I think that overall, that is starting to be understood in the culture at large. There's places and audiences I can talk to now that 10 years ago, they would have laughed me out of the room. Now I have them bringing me gifts. You know, people who are really into the bureaucratic, you know, not going to have that kind of conversation about how the plants have feelings and talk to you. You know, because we have this idea of what talking means. It means gossiping like we do. And it's like, no, you just like sense something like, oh, that guy needs some water. You know, why isn't that communication? Why isn't that seen as valid communication too? You know? It's not actually supernatural. It's all very normal and natural. So I think that conversation is happening anyway, so we can't be afraid to bring it there, but we have to be speaking all of each other's language. That's the challenge of it. It's not my language is better than yours. It's, hey, how can we help each other understand where we're coming from? What's your language that you have? What do you need? Can I help you get it? Here's what I need to help you get that language. How do I really be able to show you that this is the living archaeology? Because I don't doubt what I see. I'll do whatever I can to help you be able to see that.
So how did you do the survey exactly, and then can you speak to a little bit of what you found specifically? We're all plant geeks sitting here, and we love these plants, and yeah, like what did it look like for you? I mean, I'm sure this could be more thoroughly repeated and expanded upon, like you're saying, in these multi-layers. It can get geeky in this way or that, or maybe we could find people that know the stories of that, and that could be added in, and but like,
Yeah.
you went there many times too since the first time you visited there, so you got layers of seeing it in different times of the year and everything. But like, what was that like, and then what did you end up finding that was cool to find?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I find it all interesting, but I just went out there this spring, late April, and really my only thought was I was going to let the plants lead me. Let them, what do you have to show me? Right? So I just started walking up some of the water drainages, which in the desert are often very subtle depressions of where water flows when there's water. It's not perennial water going on right at that site. But there's a lot of water drainages there. It's a part of the watershed. So I just started walking up those and seeing who I would find and taking note of what's going on around them and where they appear and don't appear. It's something I've done with different groups of people I've shared with and been teaching to, is this idea of landscape awareness by following plants. So I was basically doing that practice. So you find a plant, even if you don't know their name, that you feel like following. I had particular plants in mind. And so you find that plant and you just start to follow where you keep seeing them. And then when you stop seeing them, or you start to see less of them, you just stop and take note of what's changed. What changed? Why am I not seeing them anymore? Or now I'm seeing a bunch of them. What's going on? If I'm looking, what changed? Is it more rocky? Is it more compacted? Is it drainage? Am I on top of a hill now? Like, what's going on? So that's basically what I was doing. So I started finding Yampa in the first drainage I was in. Yampa is a plant who shows up for me a lot in places I'm not expecting them. And Yampa's one of these desert plants that likes just a little bit more moisture held in the spring than the other ones. So you'll find her in the water drainages or on the tops of tablelands in depressions that hold water a little bit longer. That's her niche, So I just followed and took note of when I saw Yampa in the drainage, how dense was it? And my measurements were, I'm seeing one plant at least every 2 to 10 steps. That's what I was coming up with. And I had GPS when I started to find them, and GPS when I lost the trail and stuff like that. I, have a lot to learn about different kinds of surveys. I used to do that stuff a long time ago, but I haven't set them up in a while, so I'll be researching more of that soon.
Technology's probably changed around it too.
Yeah, I was using a hiking app because I had no idea what other app to download yet. There's a bunch of them. So, and then just kind of like watching to see how far up the banks Yampa went, and then besides the...
And Yampa is a plant that people traditionally tended in a lot of tribes, a lot of places.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Yampa was a very endeared first food. And she's this wild carrot friend. This very nutty, wonderful flavor. And different than the wild carrot from your ditches and stuff like that. But Perideridia is the genus. And there's 6 to 8 species in the West. maybe more. But yeah, lots of different indigenous tribes have relationships with Yampa all throughout the West, all the way into Colorado, down into New Mexico. There's some Yampas out east as well. I've never been there.
Somebody sent me a picture yesterday of one that they
Yeah.
were tending out east in the flower. I should show you. And the roots.
Nice.
I was like,
Yeah. And I really adore Yampa so much. So that she was one I was looking for, and also looking for a group of plants known as biscuit roots. Lomatium and Samopterus are the genus. These are all like staple root foods.
they're in the carrot family as well, right?
Yeah, all carrot family. Was also looking for bitterroot, which is in the miner's lettuce family.
Portulaceae, maybe?
Portulaceae.
Am I saying that right? Maybe I'm missing a syllable in there, maybe, but
There's another syllable. But Lewisii is the genus, and yeah, she's kind of a succulent one. Bitter root because the roots are kind of bitter, but another starchy root food. And the wild onions, lots of different kinds. And then your different lilies. So you're like Mariposa lilies, Calocorthus, sago lilies, and fritillaria. I really only saw Mariposa lilies this time. But yeah, anyway, so I just started walking up the drainages and following up, taking note where I saw them. And then I'd start to just go up on different hills. I started to see different small mounds on some of the banks of some of the drainages. And some of them were rather old and weathered. And some of that's mole activity, sure. And some of it seems like it could have been older digging to me. And what I start to notice about those little mounds is that that's often where you find a lot of these plants I just mentioned, is in relationship to these mounds, in relationship to digging. Up on top of some of the smaller rolling hills, you'll have like more rockier areas. And a lot of the time the rocks appear to be like they're in a flow, kind of puzzle piece together. And that's where you start to find bigger densities of some of these plants. And a part of that is from people's digging. And, you know, if you've ever dug a hole yourself, when you dig the hole, you end up exposing a lot more rocks than before. The rocks are underneath. All that soil's been eroding and collecting on top of the rocks. But you dig that hole and then the rocks come up to the surface. So, and it's hard to fully fill back in your hole again. It's like you always end up with more material than fills the hole again. I don't quite understand. But, so just the act of digging would bring more rocks to the surface. Because some of these little hills and stuff are not like on a slope where erosion would have been taking the soil away and exposing rocks. It's not that kind of topography. So, and that's where you find densities of onions. So on some of the rolling hills there, over by where ceremonial camp was, there's absolutely densities with wild onions. And then the different biscuit roots in there. And you also find arrowhead obsidian shards and stuff like that in these areas. So I think that human relation is pretty obvious there to me.
And we have stories from so many different peoples in the West, specifically about a lot of these plants. Like, about their relationships, and then so many people still practicing. At least whatever they're left with in the craziness of what's happened the past few hundred years, right?
Yeah.
And we know people have relationships with these plants.
Yeah. They
And
don't have to start from nowhere.
People who maybe lived thousands of miles from each other sometimes have similar but unique relationships with some of these plants. So we know that people, and sometimes we don't know. Like, it's in the East, there's a lot that we have to investigate even more in this assumption, but it's also obvious, like, if there's some million hickory nuts every year, and they're so good, why wouldn't people have tended them, right? But we don't necessarily have the same amount of story of connection that we have in the West. So we know that, and then we also can look at the plants themselves and see how they like to be engaged or how they like to reproduce, to have a clue to that. And as well. Like some of these plants like have adapted to disturbance in some way, and something you speak about a lot. And like, what should that look like, and who disturbs what, and what is that, what is a good disturbance or bad disturbance is like a fascinating spectrum of like, thinking about change on the land,
Yeah, it's like the beneficial disturbance. So like at Thacker Pass, Pihimaha, there's like all kinds of layers of relationship there because a lot's happened. So there's the layer of the first foods and evidence of digging that you can still see there. There also was a wildfire that came through. So you can see recovering from that. There was an area that was bulldozed as a fire break. So you can see the rabbit brush coming back and no sagebrush. There's been cattle grazing there. So you can see compacted, more powdered soil crusts. Like the crusts are gone. Just
like
from
the cryptobiotic soil is disturbed. And from
the disturbance of compaction. So in some way, this whole thing is bringing to light the beneficial disturbance that beneficial disturbance is stimulating to growth, can be stimulating to growth, and that what that looks like will be different depending on what plant you're talking about, what region you're in, timing of your disturbance, frequency, all that stuff, right? That's all from a relationship you would understand what's beneficial and what's not for what you're subjectively interacting with. But a lot of these plants propagate by, first of all, having cracks in the soil that the seeds can drop into. So that would be happening in a desert landscape that has the what do you call it?
cryptobiotic
Biotic soils on that have the crusts on top that have cracks. The biscuit root and Samopteris seeds have little papery wings on them. They're meant for wind travel on the ground. So the wind pushes those wings and they travel across the ground until those wings catch a little crack in the dirt and then fall down into the crack. And the wings disintegrate, and then that seed is in the shade and germinates in the crack. This was something that humans are replicating when they're doing their digging. They're not making it look like they haven't been there. They're leaving the rocks on top. The rocks have spaces in between them that allow the seeds to go in there and be in the shade so more of them can germinate. A lot of the roots also have smaller little bulblets that grow on them, and once those get disconnected from the main root, they grow whole new plants. So they're adapted to a long generational history of that relationship to be like, yeah, dig me. I'll just make 5 more plants,
I mean, you can say that into something I mentioned on Facebook when I reposted your article. It was like, I've been thinking about, we interviewed someone on the podcast, it was Gabe that hosted this interview with Angela Moles, the scientist. I remember how he found her work. It was like researching plants down a research hole, and she has done some TED Talks, and she's out of Australia, and she's like a professor and does all this research, but like a lot of her work is like talking about how fast plants can actually evolve. And I think about that and how we actually are wrong about certain assumptions in that sense of what is happening on the land, because we've just seen it happen in certain instances in a certain way, and then we think it's all like that. And I think about that with things like these particular plants that have a long-standing human relationship, and how she was showing in her work like how a plant, moved from where it's supposedly co-evolved for 1 million years to another place over like not that long a period of time. It's speciated into a different, enough to where it couldn't really go back and reproduce with the mother plant too easily. Well, I think about that same, we don't necessarily need science to prove these things because it's just obvious too, but like, why would plants create those extra features if it wasn't responding to being loved by somebody? I mean, and our bodies are made from the plants, and then they're there because we love them, but not just we as humans, but other animals and creatures and stuff. So it's like, well, the big we, but also the human we, right? Like, why would a Mariposa lily make bulblets or Fritillaria make cormorants, right? I guess the botanical correct word is. Like, I mean, sure, there's other things that we could just explain as why they did that. But why is it so crazy to imagine that humans are a part of that story of that plant actually looking that way and doing that thing, too? I think about that, like, well, that's an evidence, too, in itself. Like, the fact that they even exist the way they do in general. But that's even crazier of a thing, you know? But, like, to me, that they're all there in the particular kind of way that you're describing, you know, you're noticing, but also the fact that they... Because, I mean, would they exist without us, even? And will they in 100 years? I don't know. Questions.
I think that a lot of these plants are disappearing in areas because we're not having that relation anymore. And a part of that is just because you have a different disturbance regime there. So, again, to bring up the idea of land use, so then you have a more of a simplified use that has a different disturbance fingerprint. So you have more of a compacting one by putting grazing animals or big machines to haul the lumber out or whatever. That all has an effect on what plants can be there. You know, it shapes things. So, yeah, I've heard it mentioned that the plants miss us, you know. A lot of these plants miss us because that relation can make them more abundant, and we can see that in lots of different places. And people would be planting those things everywhere they were going because you're just living your life and moving around. And so why wouldn't you? You know? Yeah. So I think the thing about Thacker Pass too is that, you know, it is a pass. It's a pass in the mountains there, and it was a corridor of migration for humans and other beings, all kinds. And yeah, there's things to dig out there. There's planting done and people passing through. Might not have been a place that was a winter camp. I don't know the particular stories, you know. But what I do know is that you find these plants in all these different areas because people were moving through and living there and staying a while in different places and whatever. So a part of it too, you know, there's a bunch of other lithium claims in the area, and it's just bringing to mind this, you know, our fragmented vision of background vision gets applied to everything. So we'll think of biodiversity and we'll be trying to apply it to one site, right? So then maybe the same thing happens when we're trying to make a case for the protection of a site.
Or one moment in time.
Or one moment in time. Yeah, we're still, we're limiting the understanding of that site in context in relation to the surrounding area, and we're underestimating the effect that demolishing that one place will have on the surrounding landscape. So this is why I was bringing up the part about focusing on the commonality of some of these plants that have a relationship with humans as the archaeological focus. Is that you find them continuously in these different sites. Some places you will find them in much more density because people spent a longer time there. It doesn't mean that the pass down the way where they didn't have a winter camp isn't just as important archaeologically. You needed both of those places to have that lifeway. You needed the pass and you needed the hill or the protected area that was dry enough for you to have your camp. So yeah, we can talk about what's at a site, and that's the intention, is to, you know, say this is a part of the story of this site in relation to the plants. But also the bigger picture is that it's all in context with the surrounding landscape. Especially if you're trying to consider a nomadic lifeway, it wouldn't make sense to just be focusing on one site. That's still a settled approach. Settled lifeway approach. Yeah.
And you've been doing a little bit of surveying at some other sites too that you've heard could potentially be at risk in the same way, and kind of doing preemptive.
Yeah, I've been starting looking, and I plan to continue to go see what that story is with the plants there in the spring.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, is there any you know, you have been working on this for a little bit, and it's also like connected to what you've been doing outside of Thacker Pass for many years, but you published your findings, at least in a digestible form for the public, recently, in article form, and it's found in a couple places online, and we'll link it in the show notes. But what is your hope for making that public, and like what would you like from others who might be interested or like curious,
Well, I would really like to have other people be able to see these things. I'm thinking about maybe doing some walks at some of these other sites, inviting people to come out, maybe different groups of people. I also very much would love to hear other people's stories. I would love to have indigenous stories of their tending in these areas. I would like to be able to help facilitate that voice and that understanding coming out in this way, and see if there's a curiosity and a desire to follow this thread of living archaeology. So yeah, I'm really just putting the patterns I see out there in hopes that other people come and corroborate that. I need the other stories. Yeah. I've had a couple of contacts from different archaeologists, actually. So
since you put the article out?
Yeah, I had a couple different emails. People being curious about things they've seen in the places they've been. So
archaeologists aren't usually trained in botany or like ethnobotany, or maybe sometimes ethnobotany to a point.
Yeah.
Or herbalism or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a bridging worlds opportunity. Yeah, there seems to be interest in that understanding too. So yeah, I'm just hoping for more people to share this seeing with, to make it understood, to help anchor it as a valid way for seeing a landscape, a valid reason for protecting, and an invitation to step back into that understanding of kinship. So
cool.
Yeah.
Well, I hope that in putting this podcast episode out, we can get more people reading it and thinking about this, and hopefully that can happen. I mean, I don't know what's going to really happen with Thacker Pass. I don't know if any of us really know. I mean, it seems like a big thing to fight against, just like Rio Tinto and Oak Flat, but it's still worthy of trying,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And there's very wonderful, dedicated commitment campaign going on at Thacker Pass. So in the article, I posted links to groups that are involved there. So yeah, there's definitely some passionate and dedicated efforts happening down at Oak Flat too. So, and I think that's heartening to see that our regular human direct engagement is like works actually. We just start to doubt that it does. So, but it works.
Cool. Well, thanks for sitting down and sharing with me more about this whole thing, and we'll go and do our river swims and other things now, and go play.
Yes. Become crepuscular in the desert.
Crepuscular, never heard that one.
That means you're active during the morning and the evening.
Oh.
But you're like just dead during the day because it's too hot.
Yeah.
You just listened to an episode of the Ground Shots podcast featuring Nikki Hill with assistance by Sigh-Moon, recorded this past August in South Central Oregon. The music for this episode was by Juniper Blue, and the songs featured included Spires, The Undergrowth, and Reverie. So there's a lot mentioned in this episode that I wanted to include in the show notes. A lot of resources, books, links to different things that could help you further research some of the stuff that we went into. So check out the show notes for this episode to be able to figure out a little more in the tendrils of what this interview and conversation touches, and I hope you do enjoy going down some of those paths. I have Nikki's links and how to contact her here in the show notes as well, and how you can read her article that we are talking about in this episode, so I hope you go and read that. Well, thanks y'all for listening, and really appreciate your continued support and listenership. Until next time.